What if the earliest words ever pressed into wet clay were not written for human eyes at all? What if they were echoes, not beginnings, records of a world already ancient, already burdened, already unfolding according to rules that did not yet include us? There is a strange stillness that surrounds the first Sumerian tablets, a stillness that does not feel empty but withheld, as if something essential has been deliberately left unsaid. Names appear without introduction. Actions occur without context. Time stretches backward into a depth where humanity is absent, unnecessary, almost accidental, and, before you allow your body to sink completely into this quiet, take just a very small moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if something in these words makes you want to remain here a little longer. If you wish, share the place and the time where you're listening. I am always curious about the small points of light drifting together through the same night, because beneath these ancient signs, beneath the measured strokes of a reed pressed into clay, there waits a question that never fully settled. What were the Anunnaki doing before humanity existed, and why does that memory feel fractured, unfinished, almost deliberately blurred? The Sumerians did not write as beginners. This is perhaps the first discomfort that emerges when one lingers with their texts long enough. Their earliest inscriptions do not grope forward in confusion, as one might expect from the dawn of writing. They catalogue, assign, record, and remember, with the confidence of a culture inheriting something older than itself. Temples already aligned, rituals already standardized, the cosmos already ordered into tiers of sky, earth, and underworld. Even the gods arrive fully named, fully placed, as though they had always been there. Among these names, the Anunnaki stand apart, not merely as deities, but as a collective, a lineage, a function. The term itself resists simple translation. It gestures toward descent, toward origin, toward those who came down from something higher. Yet the text rarely paused to explain who they are in absolute terms. Instead, they are simply present, already engaged in tasks, decisions, conflicts. Their existence is treated as self-evident, requiring no justification. What is more unsettling is when these texts speak of a time before humans, and do so without ceremony. There is no dramatic creation yet, no clay shaped into flesh. Instead, there is work. There is fatigue. There is imbalance. The world is active, but strained. Fields are mentioned without farmers. Waters are directed without caretakers. Authority exists, but its mechanisms appear overextended, as though the system itself is nearing a limit. In several compositions, the gods labor. This detail is often softened in modern retellings, reframed as metaphor or moral allegory, but the original language does not always invite such comfort. The verbs used are physical, repetitive, exhausting, carrying, digging, maintaining. The cosmos is not self-sustaining in these accounts. It demands effort. And effort over time becomes a problem. It is here that the silence thickens. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as omnipotent creators resting in perfection. They negotiate, they argue, they convene councils. Decisions are made not in triumph, but in response to pressure. Something is not working as intended. Something must change. Yet humanity does not appear immediately as an answer. There is a pause in the narrative, a conceptual gap where the problem exists without its eventual solution. This pause is rarely examined. It is passed over quickly, as though too obvious to require attention. But in that gap, the implication lingers. The world functioned before humans, but at a cost. Time itself behaves strangely in this pre-human space. Later, king lists will record reigns stretching tens of thousands of years, rulers whose lifespans defy biological sense. Scholars debate whether these numbers are symbolic, ceremonial, or misunderstood. But even when treated symbolically, they reveal something important. Memory here is not compressed. It is vast. It does not begin where we expect history to begin. The Anunnaki belong to this vastness. They are situated in a deep temporal layer, one that does not measure existence by generations but by cycles. Their concerns are systemic rather than personal. They oversee processes rather than individuals, and when strain appears, it is the strain of a system reaching imbalance, not a single event gone wrong. Modern frameworks struggle with this kind of narrative. We are accustomed to beginnings that center us, to creation stories that culminate in human arrival as purpose fulfilled. But the Sumerian texts resist this structure. Humanity, when it finally emerges, does not feel like a triumph. It feels like an intervention. This raises an uncomfortable question, one that has hovered at the edges of scholarship without ever being fully embraced. If humans were introduced into an already functioning world, what problem were they meant to address? And more quietly still, what does it mean to be created not as an end, but as a means? Translation has not helped us here. Over centuries, scribes, priests, and later scholars have smoothed the edges of these stories, aligning them with theological expectations that favor intention and harmony. Ambiguities are resolved. Conflicts are moralized. Labor becomes allegory. But the clay tablets themselves, cracked and incomplete, often tell a less subtle story. Their breaks are not only physical, they occur in logic, in motivation, in sequence. It is tempting to dismiss these tensions as the natural inconsistencies of myth. Yet myths usually exaggerate coherence rather than fracture it. They close gaps, they reassure. The Sumerian material does something stranger. It preserves uncertainty. It leaves motivations partially opaque. It assumes familiarity with a past the listener no longer fully possesses. Perhaps this is why the Anunnaki feel distant even within their own narratives. They are central, yet emotionally remote. They do not confide. They do not explain themselves. They act, decide, withdraw. And when humanity eventually enters the stage, it does so into a world already shaped by prior decisions whose reasons are no longer fully accessible. There is a subtle grief embedded in this structure, a sense that something foundational has been lost between then and now. Not lost in a dramatic catastrophe, but eroded through retelling, translation, and the quiet pressure to make the past resemble the present. What remains is a skeleton of a story, its deeper tissues stripped away. If the Anunnaki were once involved in processes that predate humanity, then our earliest records are not beginnings at all. They are midpoints, and midpoints are dangerous places to start understanding anything. The question, then, is not whether these texts describe literal beings or symbolic forces. That debate may never resolve. The more unsettling possibility lies elsewhere, that they preserve the memory of a world whose logic no longer aligns with our own, a world in which humanity was not central, not necessary, and not inevitable. And if that is true, then what else in our historical memory has been quietly reorganized to place us at the center? What other silences have been mistaken for clarity? What other questions were set aside because they did not serve the story we preferred to tell ourselves? The tablets do not answer these questions, they simply wait. And in their waiting they invite another. When a story begins after its true beginning has already passed, how much of its meaning can ever be recovered? If the first part left a hollow space, an awareness that the story begins too late, then the second deepens that hollow into something more deliberate. Because once the Anunnaki are named, once they step into the tablets without origin or explanation, the unease does not fade, it sharpens. Names, after all, are rarely neutral. In ancient languages, they do not simply label, they compress memory, function, and hierarchy into sound. The word Anunnaki is often translated loosely as those who came from heaven to earth. Yet this rendering is already a decision and not a certainty. In Sumerian, the term unfolds into components that gesture toward ancestry, descent, and authority, and evokes the high sky, the domain of order and distance. Key anchors downward, toward earth, materiality, consequence. Between them lies motion, connection, and tension. The Anunnaki are not simply beings who arrive. They are positioned between realms, inheritors of a structure that predates human social logic. What is rarely emphasized is how casually the texts assume familiarity with them. There is no narrative pause to situate who they are for an audience encountering them for the first time. They are invoked as one might invoke weather or gravity, forces already known, already accepted. This suggests that even in the earliest written form, these stories were not new. They were transcriptions of something older, perhaps once transmitted orally, perhaps once experienced as reality rather than metaphor. In some compositions, the Anunnaki are described as arbiters of fate, assigners of roles, stabilizers of cosmic order. In others, they are embroiled in dispute, divided in allegiance, subject to fatigue and frustration. These portrayals are not easily reconciled. Modern theological systems often seek consistency, but the Sumerian record does not appear concerned with that. Instead, it preserves layers, older functions overlain with newer interpretations, as if the meaning of the Anunnaki had shifted even for the Sumerians themselves. This shifting identity raises a quiet but persistent question. Were the Anunnaki always understood as gods, or did the category of God emerge later, as language struggled to contain something that no longer fit neatly into human experience? In early texts, divinity does not equate to moral perfection or infinite power. It often signifies authority, longevity, proximity to foundational processes. The Anunnaki are powerful not because they transcend the world, but because they are embedded deeply within its operation. One of the more unsettling details is their association with decision-making rather than creation. They are present at moments of judgment, of redistribution, of correction. When imbalance appears, they respond not with wonder but with administration. Councils are convened, roles are reassigned, solutions are debated. This is not the language of mythic spontaneity. It is the language of governance. Governance implies responsibility. Responsibility implies burden, and burden implies limitation. Several texts hint at a division among the divine, a stratification that mirrors labor hierarchies more than spiritual ones. Some beings toil, others oversee. The Anunnaki occupy an upper tier, yet they are not free from consequence. Their authority binds them to outcomes they did not fully anticipate. When systems falter, they cannot simply abandon them without cost. It is here that the idea of descent becomes more than symbolic. To descend is not merely to travel downward in space, but to engage with complication, with material resistance. If the Anunnaki are those of descent, then their identity may be defined by involvement rather than transcendence. They are not distant watchers, they are participants. This reframes the pre-human world described in the tablets. It was not a static paradise awaiting humanity. It was a working system, already stressed, already evolving. The Anunnaki did not preside over perfection. They managed instability. Their actions are not framed as benevolent gifts, but as necessary adjustments within an imperfect structure. Over time, as these stories were retold and reinterpreted, something subtle occurred. The complexity of the Anunnaki began to flatten. Roles hardened into archetypes. Administration transformed into omnipotence. Distance replaced involvement. This process is not unique to Sumer. It appears across cultures whenever memory stretches beyond lived experience. What was once specific becomes symbolic. What was once procedural becomes sacred. Yet the tablets retain traces of the earlier layers. Inconsistencies remain. Motives are unclear. Outcomes feel provisional rather than final. These are not the marks of careless storytelling. They are the marks of a tradition preserving fragments it no longer fully understands. Linguists have long noted that Sumerian itself is an isolate, a language without clear relatives. This isolation mirrors the conceptual isolation of the Anunnaki within the texts. They do not fit comfortably into later mythological frameworks. They are neither purely elemental nor entirely anthropomorphic. They occupy a category that resists inheritance. This resistance may explain why later cultures reimagined them. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions absorbed the Anunnaki but altered their emphasis. Names shifted, functions merged. Some aspects faded entirely. Memory adapted to new social needs. Authority was centralized. The cosmos became more morally legible, but adaptation always involves loss. If the Anunnaki once represented a class of beings defined by function within a pre-human system, then their gradual transformation into distant gods may signal more than religious evolution. It may reflect humanity's discomfort with origins that do not center us. A world governed before our arrival threatens the assumption that we are the purpose of history. And so, the Anunnaki recede. They become symbolic ancestors rather than active managers. Their fatigue becomes allegory. Their disputes become moral lessons. The labor they oversaw disappears behind creation myths that place humanity at the climax. Yet the earliest layers still whisper something else. They suggest that humanity enters a story already underway, one shaped by forces that did not arise with us and may not resolve through us. They imply that creation was not an act of celebration, but of necessity. If that is so, then the Anunnaki are not merely figures of worship or fear. They are reminders of a deeper past in which intelligence, organization, and consequence existed without human presence. And that possibility carries a quiet weight. Because if authority once operated without us, then it may continue to do so in ways we no longer recognize. And if the Anunnaki were not gods in the way we later imagined, but something closer to stewards or inheritors of an older system, then their disappearance does not mark an end. It marks a handover. The tablets do not tell us what followed that handover in clear terms. They only show us the transition beginning to take shape. Humanity is not yet present, but the conditions for its arrival are forming. And this leads to a question that lingers just beneath the surface of every line. When a system creates something new to relieve its own strain, does it do so for the benefit of that creation, or for its own survival? Once the Anunnaki are understood not as distant creators but as participants bound to a system already in motion, the landscape around them begins to change. The world described in the earliest Sumerian memory no longer feels like a blank canvas awaiting human touch. It feels occupied, active, shaped by processes that do not require human presence to function. And this realization draws attention to a subtle but persistent theme woven through the tablets. The memory of an earth that existed before us, and not merely as a void, but as a place with rhythm, burden, and demand. The texts speak of land before agriculture, yet not before order. Rivers are already named, boundaries already implied, waters are directed, channels maintained, and regions distinguished by purpose. This is not the chaotic wilderness of later mythic imagination. It is an organized environment, one that requires oversight and adjustment. The absence of humans is not emphasized as a loss. It is treated as normal. In several early compositions, nature does not act alone. It responds. Floodwaters do not simply rise. They are restrained or released. Fertility is not random. It is apportioned. These descriptions are often dismissed as poetic devices, but their consistency suggests something more structural. The world behaves like a managed system, one that reacts to intervention rather than unfolding purely on its own terms. What is striking is that this management precedes humanity entirely. There are references to tasks performed, duties assigned, and balances maintained long before humans appear as actors. The earth is productive, yet demanding. Resources exist, but their extraction or maintenance carries cost. This cost accumulates over time, and the texts do not shy away from acknowledging it. In later mythologies, Gods create the world and then withdraw, leaving it to humans. The Sumerian memory resists this arc. Withdrawal is gradual, contested, and incomplete. The Anunnaki remain engaged for long stretches, responding to strain rather than celebrating completion. Their world is not finished. It is ongoing. This sense of an unfinished world becomes especially apparent in descriptions of cyclical time. Seasons recur, but not effortlessly. Cosmic order is stable, but only through repetition and vigilance. There is no implication that harmony is self-sustaining. Instead, equilibrium appears fragile, requiring attention across immense spans of time. Geological echoes quietly align with this perspective. Long before humans could observe them, the Earth moved through cycles of climate instability. Glacial advances, sudden warming, shifting sea levels. Modern science documents these processes in ice cores and sediment layers, revealing a planet shaped by repetition and disruption rather than linear progress. The Sumerian texts do not describe these events scientifically, but they do preserve an intuition of a world defined by cycles rather than permanence. This intuition matters. It suggests that the pre-human Earth was not imagined as static, but as a system vulnerable to imbalance, and vulnerability invites management. The Anunnaki appear repeatedly in proximity to thresholds, points where order risks slipping into excess or depletion. Their presence clusters around moments of adjustment rather than creation. This pattern implies that they emerge in response to stress, not as architects of initial design. They intervene when processes strain beyond tolerance. It is tempting to interpret these interventions as purely mythic metaphors for natural forces, but metaphors usually simplify. Here, the complexity remains. Decisions are debated, outcomes are uncertain. Authority is exercised with caution rather than certainty. These are not the hallmarks of personified storms or seasons. They resemble the dynamics of stewardship. Stewardship implies foresight, but also limitation. A steward cannot reshape reality at will. They work within constraints. This may explain why the Anunnaki do not simply resolve the growing imbalance through direct action. The system they oversee resists simple solutions. Every intervention carries consequence. The absence of humans in this phase is therefore significant. Humanity is not required for the world to exist, but something about the world's operation begins to exceed what the existing structure can sustain. The text hinted a growing accumulation of burden, tasks multiplying, responsibilities intensifying, cycles demanding more attention than before. This accumulation is never quantified, but it is felt. Language shifts subtly toward fatigue, toward unrest, toward dissatisfaction among those who labor within the system. The Earth itself does not rebel, those who maintain it do. In this light, the pre-human Earth becomes a place of quiet tension. It is not hostile, but it is demanding. It offers abundance, but at the cost of continual effort. And effort stretched across deep time becomes unsustainable. One begins to sense that the arrival of humanity is not framed as destiny, but as relief. Not relief for the Earth, but for those bound to its maintenance. Humanity emerges not as the crown of creation, but as a response to exhaustion elsewhere. This reframing unsettles familiar narratives. It positions humans not as the purpose of the world, but as a function within it. A role introduced late, under pressure, into a system already carrying the weight of its own history. If the pre-human Earth was managed rather than created, then the Anunnaki's relationship to it was pragmatic rather than reverent. They did not worship nature, they negotiated with it. They responded to its cycles, adjusted its flows, and absorbed the consequences when balance failed. And when those consequences began to exceed their capacity, the texts suggest a turning point approaching. Not a catastrophe yet, but an inflection. The system does not collapse, but it strains loudly enough to demand reconsideration of its structure. The quiet implication is that the world itself was never meant to run unattended. It requires agents. It requires labor. And labor, if concentrated too narrowly, generates unrest. At this threshold, humanity is not yet present, but the conditions for its introduction are forming. The Earth is no longer merely a setting, it is a participant, exerting pressure on those responsible for its continuity. This raises a subtle but profound question. If the Earth before humanity was already managed, already burdened, already approaching a limit, then human existence begins not as a gift, but as a response to necessity. And if that is so, then the story of humanity does not begin with wonder, but with obligation. The tablets do not linger on this realization. They move forward, toward the solution rather than dwelling on the problem. But the problem remains encoded in what they do not explain, in the assumptions they make about a world that does not need us to exist. The pre-human Earth, as remembered in these texts, is neither paradise nor chaos. It is a working environment under strain, and those who oversee it are reaching the edge of endurance. What follows from this strain is not yet stated, but it is inevitable. When systems reach their limits, they either collapse or adapt, and somewhere within this deep memory, adaptation is already beginning to take shape. As the pressure within this pre-human system accumulates, the tablets begin to speak more clearly, not in declarations, but in tone. A change settles into the language, subtle at first, then unmistakable. What had once been described as duty becomes weight. What had once been routine begins to feel repetitive, unending. The world continues to function, but the cost of maintaining it grows heavier with each cycle. It is here that labor steps into focus, not as metaphor but as lived condition. The Sumerian texts describe work in terms that are strikingly concrete. There is lifting, digging, channeling, transporting. These are not symbolic gestures of cosmic harmony. They are physical acts, extended over time, repeated without respite. The beings who perform them are not abstract forces. They complain, they resist, they reach limits. Later traditions will soften this tension, recasting labor as a divine role willingly embraced. But the earliest layers preserve something less polished. There is dissatisfaction among those who work. There is murmuring. There is imbalance not only in the earth, but among its overseers. The system strains not because nature fails, but because its maintenance demands too much from too few. This is one of the most easily overlooked details in the Anunnaki narratives, perhaps because it sits uncomfortably with later theological expectations. Gods, as we often imagine them, do not tire. They do not protest their own roles. Yet here, exhaustion is not hidden. It becomes the catalyst for change. Some texts describe a division among the divine, those who labor and those who command. This division is not framed as injustice but as structure. Still, structure does not guarantee harmony. Over time, imbalance sharpens. The laboring beings begin to question why their burden persists without relief. Their frustration is not ideological, it is physical. The significance of this cannot be overstated. It suggests that the crisis preceding humanity's creation was not cosmic rebellion or moral failure, but logistical strain, too much work, too much repetition, too much maintenance stretched across too much time. In human history, such moments often precede systemic change. When labor concentrates without redistribution, unrest follows. The Sumerian memory appears to preserve this pattern at a scale far larger than human society, yet familiar in its dynamics. The Anunnaki are not immune to this unrest. They preside over it. They are implicated in it. Their authority does not shield them from its consequences. Instead, it binds them to the responsibility of addressing it. Councils form. Decisions are debated. The language becomes procedural, careful, constrained by necessity rather than desire. This moment is often misread as a moral fable, lesser gods rebelling against greater ones. But such readings flatten the texture of the original material. What emerges instead is a portrait of a system confronting its own inefficiency. The issue is not disobedience, it is sustainability. The earth continues to demand attention. Rivers must be directed, fertility must be regulated, cycles must be monitored. None of this can be abandoned without consequence. Yet continuing as before is no longer viable. The burden has reached a threshold. What is striking is how little emotion the text assigned to this realization. There is no dramatic anguish, no lamentation. The tone remains measured, almost bureaucratic. This restraint lends the moment a quiet gravity. Decisions made here are not impulsive, they are calculated, and calculation implies precedent. One senses that this is not the first time the system has approached such a limit. The calm with which the problem is addressed suggests familiarity. Perhaps cycles of strain and adjustment have occurred before, long before these words were pressed into clay. The tablets do not say, they assume understanding rather than explanation. At this juncture, humanity still does not appear. Instead, the focus remains on redistribution, on alleviation, on finding a way to preserve order without collapsing under its weight. The solution, when it begins to form, does so slowly, as if resisted even by those who conceive it. This resistance matters. It implies that what is about to happen is not without cost or consequence. Introducing a new element into an already delicate system is not taken lightly. It carries risk. It alters balance. It cannot be undone easily. The Anunnaki do not rush toward creation. They hesitate. And in that hesitation, the outlines of humanity begin to appear. Not as beings yet, but as concept, as possibility, as function. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the narrative. Humanity is not imagined in terms of identity or destiny, but utility. The question is not who humans will be, but what they will do, what burden they might carry, what tasks they might assume. Modern readers often recoil at this framing, instinctively translating it into exploitation or domination. But the texts themselves are quieter. They do not moralize. They present necessity without commentary. The system requires relief. A solution must be found. Still, even within this pragmatic tone, attention lingers. Introducing a new class of laborers does not eliminate the problem of labor. It redistributes it. It shifts burden downward. It creates hierarchy. And hierarchy, once established, tends to persist. The Anunnaki's role in this transition is complex. They are neither villains nor saviors. They are administrators responding to pressure within a structure they did not fully design and can no longer fully sustain. Their authority is real, but it's constrained by circumstance. This complexity is often lost when these stories are retold as myths of creation. The focus shifts to origins, to beginnings, to meaning. But the original material is less concerned with meaning than with continuity. How does the world keep going without breaking those who maintain it? The question lingers beneath every line, and it is not resolved cleanly. As the idea of introducing humanity edges closer to articulation, the tablets grow quieter again. Details recede. The moment before creation stretches, suspended. We are left with a sense of a decision approaching, heavy with implication. Humanity has not yet been formed, but its shadow is already cast. It appears first not as a figure, but as a redistribution of effort, a response to exhaustion, a way to preserve order by sharing its weight. This reframes the entire arc of human existence. If we are born into the story at a moment of crisis, then our role is defined by inheritance rather than intention. We enter not as chosen heirs, but as necessary participants. A necessity rarely concerns itself with comfort or consent. The tablets do not ask whether humanity should be created. They ask whether the system can continue without change. That distinction matters, because when a system adapts under strain, it often does so without regard for those who will bear the consequences. The relief of one layer becomes the burden of another. As the Anunnaki move toward a solution, the question shifts quietly, almost imperceptibly. If humanity is introduced to solve a problem it did not create, what does that imply about the kind of existence it will inherit? And more quietly still, what happens when those who are meant to relieve the burden begin to feel its weight themselves? When the decision finally begins to take shape, it does not arrive as a thunderclap. There is no single sentence in the tablets that announces creation as triumph. Instead, the language tightens, words grow technical, actions become precise. The tone shifts away from debate and toward implementation. Whatever hesitation once existed has narrowed into resolve, not because doubt vanished, but because delay has become impossible. This is where the story subtly changes its gravity. Creation, as it appears here, is not wonder, it is intervention. The verbs matter. In the Sumerian texts, the making of humanity is not described with words that imply effortless conjuring. There is no spontaneous speech that brings beings into existence. Instead, there is shaping, mixing, assembling. These are verbs of craft, of process, of adjustment. They suggest modification rather than invention. Something is taken, something is combined, something is altered to fit a need. This distinction has long unsettled translators and theologians alike. It resists the comfort of absolute beginnings. It implies continuity rather than rupture. Humanity does not emerge from nothing. It emerges from what already exists, reconfigured to serve a new function. The materials themselves are described obliquely. Clay appears frequently, but clay here is not inert matter. It is associated with life, with moisture, with potential. In the ancient Near East, clay was understood as a liminal substance, neither solid nor fluid, capable of transformation. To shape clay is not merely to form an object, but to guide a process already underway. Alongside clay appears another element, more controversial, more carefully phrased. Something of essence, something that carries agency. The texts are restrained here, as though aware of the weight of what they imply. This essence is not introduced as divine generosity. It is described as necessity. Without it, the new beings cannot function. With it, the burden can finally be redistributed. Much has been written about these passages, often with an urgency that exceeds their tone. Modern interpretations sometimes push toward the sensational, reading, biological intervention, or genetic manipulation into every ambiguous line. Others retreat entirely, dissolving the details into metaphor. But the tablets themselves remain stubbornly grounded. They do not speculate, they record. What they record is a process that feels neither mystical nor purely symbolic. It feels procedural, deliberate, bounded by constraints. The Anunnaki do not appear to create humanity alone. Roles are divided, authorities consulted, consent is implied, if not explicitly stated. This collective involvement suggests awareness of consequence. Whatever is about to be introduced will alter the system permanently. Responsibility must be shared, and still there is restraint. Humanity is not described as equal, not yet. The language frames humans as capable but limited, skilled but subordinate. The purpose is clear even when the tone remains neutral. Humans are introduced to work. This is not punishment, it is assignment. The discomfort many modern readers feel at this point often stems from expectation rather than text. We expect creation to be celebratory, affirming, centered on identity. Instead, we encounter something colder, more functional. Humanity is not asked who it wants to be. It is shaped according to what is needed. Yet even within this utilitarian framing, there are hints of unpredictability. The essence given is not mechanical. It carries will. It introduces variability. The solution is not perfect. It is sufficient. This sufficiency is crucial. The system does not seek an ideal outcome. It seeks relief. Sustainability. The threshold has been crossed, where perfection is less important than continuation. In human terms, this moment resembles technological adaptation under pressure. When existing methods fail, new tools are introduced not because they are elegant, but because they work. Their side effects are acknowledged only later. The tablets do not linger on the aftermath of creation. They do not immediately celebrate success. Instead, they move forward cautiously, as if uncertain how the system will respond to its own alteration. Humanity begins to act, to labor, to assume tasks once borne by others. The burden shifts, relief follows, but relief is never absolute. What remains unsaid is as telling us what is recorded. There is no reflection on whether this new arrangement is just. There is no meditation on the experience of the newly created beings. Their inner lives are not explored. Their emergence is framed entirely through external function. This absence does not indicate cruelty. It indicates distance. The narrative perspective remains with those who initiated the change, not those who must live within it. Humanity is present but not yet central to the story it inhabits. Over time this will change. Later texts will elevate humans, grant them stories, struggles, moral significance. But here, at the threshold of their introduction, they are still background, tools within a larger mechanism. This challenges deeply held assumptions about human uniqueness. It suggests that what makes us significant is not origin, but duration. We become central not because we were intended as such, but because we remain after others withdraw, and withdraw they do, gradually. The Anunnaki do not vanish immediately. They oversee the transition. They monitor outcomes, they adjust, but their involvement becomes less direct. Humanity takes on more responsibility, more labor, more presence. The system stabilizes, at least temporarily. Stability, however, is not resolution. It is pause. The creation of humanity resolves one problem while planting the seeds of another. Burden has been redistributed but not eliminated. Authority has been maintained, but at the cost of distance. The system continues, but now includes beings who experience its weight differently. This difference matters. Humans do not experience time as the Anunnaki do. Their lives are shorter, their memories fragment, their understanding narrows. What begins as assignment will eventually be misunderstood as destiny. And so, the origin of humanity, as preserved in these texts, is not a story of ascent. It is a story of insertion. Humans are placed into an ongoing structure, given roles without full context, and left to interpret their existence from within the labor they perform. This reframes the meaning of early human consciousness. If the first humans were created to work, then awareness itself may have emerged alongside obligation. Identity formed not in freedom, but in service. The tablets do not condemn this. They do not praise it. They simply record the transition and move on. But the quiet question lingers, unresolved and unsettling. When a being is created to solve a problem it did not cause, how long before it begins to ask why the problem existed at all? And when that question finally surfaces, does the system that required the solution still remember how to answer? After humanity enters the system, the tablets do something unexpected. They do not linger on the novelty of this new presence. There is no sustained curiosity about human consciousness, no wonder at self-awareness awakening. Instead, the narrative attention drifts elsewhere, toward a quieter, more troubling concern, the substance of what has been made, and what that substance now carries forward through time. The language surrounding humanity's composition remains deliberately restrained, but its implications are difficult to ignore. Clay alone is insufficient. Shaping matter is not enough to produce continuity. Something else is required. Something transferable, something that binds the new beings into the existing order, rather than leaving them as inert constructs. This additional element is never described in expansive terms. It is introduced sparingly, almost reluctantly, as though too much clarity would invite questions the text is not prepared to answer. Later traditions will inflate this moment, transforming it into a gift of soul, breath, or divine favor. But the earliest layers resist such embellishment. What is transferred is not framed as blessing, it is framed as requirement. Without it, the system does not function. This distinction is subtle, but profound. A gift implies generosity. A requirement implies necessity. Humanity is not elevated through this transfer. It is enabled, brought online rather than exalted. What exactly is transferred remains ambiguous, and that ambiguity has generated centuries of debate. Some scholars emphasize symbolic inheritance, a parsing of authority, responsibility, or order. Others focus on biological metaphor, pointing to the language of mixing, binding, and activation. The texts themselves do not settle a matter. They allow both readings to coexist without resolution. What is clear is that this transfer creates continuity. Humans do not merely work, they persist. They reproduce. They extend the system forward through time in a way that earlier laborers could not. This persistence introduces a new dynamic: accumulation. The Anunnaki operated across immense spans of time, but they did not multiply. Their presence was stable, limited in number. Humanity, by contrast, expands. It fills space. It transforms landscapes. What begins as relief gradually becomes influence. This is not portrayed as rebellion or betrayal. It is simply consequence. Once introduced, humans cannot remain neutral. Their labor reshapes the world they maintain. Over generations, the distinction between caretaker and environment begins to blur. The tablets hint at this shift without dramatizing it. References to increasing human activity appear alongside subtle changes in tone. The earth becomes louder, more crowded. Processes once managed from above now unfold from within. Authority diffuses. This diffusion creates unease. The Anunnaki do not lose power immediately, but they begin to withdraw. Oversight becomes indirect. Presence becomes symbolic. Humanity assumes more autonomy, though not necessarily more understanding. Here, memory begins to fracture. The earliest humans inherit tasks without context. They perform rituals whose origins are no longer fully accessible. They repeat actions because they have always been repeated, not because their initial purpose remains clear. Meaning thins, practice persists. This thinning is not accidental. It is a natural outcome of scale. When a system designed for oversight transitions to self-maintenance, information is lost. Complexity is simplified. Procedures become tradition. The Anunnaki, in withdrawing, leave behind structures rather than explanations. Temples replace councils. Priests replace administrators. Symbols replace processes. What was once managed directly becomes mediated through belief. This is where divinity begins to harden. The Anunnaki, once embedded within the system, are gradually repositioned above it. Distance grows. Their earlier involvement in labor and decision-making fades from memory. They become sources rather than participants, origins rather than actors. This transformation is not imposed from above. It emerges from below. Humanity, lacking access to the full scope of the system it maintains, reinterprets its origins through the lens available to it. Power becomes sacred. Absence becomes transcendence. Yet traces of the earlier relationship remain. Inconsistencies persist in the texts. Moments where gods argue, where fatigue is mentioned, where decisions feel contingent rather than absolute. These fragments resist full sanctification. They remind us that the distance was not always there. The substance transferred into humanity carries these fragments forward, not as explicit memory, but as pattern. Humans inherit not only labor, but uncertainty, not only responsibility, but confusion. This inheritance shapes early human culture profoundly. Work becomes identity, obligation becomes meaning. Existence is understood through service rather than self-determination. Over time, this framework solidifies into social order. Hierarchy mirrors origin. Those closest to perceived authority command, those further down labor. The structure feels natural because it echoes the conditions of humanity's introduction. What began as cosmic necessity becomes social norm. The tablets do not critique this outcome. They do not endorse it either. They simply record its emergence. What they do suggest, quietly, is that something was lost in the transition. The Anunnaki's withdrawal creates a vacuum, not of power, but of comprehension. Humans continue the system without fully understanding its design. They maintain cycles whose initial conditions are no longer visible. This loss of comprehension has consequences. When imbalance returns, humans respond differently. Lacking the perspective of deep time, they interpret disruption as punishment rather than strain. Floods become moral judgments. Droughts become failures of devotion. The system grows harsher in human hands, not because humans are cruel, but because they lack the contextual distance once provided by those who preceded them. What was once managed through adjustment is now addressed through appeasement. This shift marks a turning point. Humanity becomes not only laborer, but interpreter. It assigns meaning where context has vanished. It constructs narratives to explain pressures it cannot otherwise resolve. In this way, religion emerges not as revelation, but as adaptation. A method of stabilizing a system whose original logic has been partially erased. The Anunnaki recede further into abstraction. Their earlier role as administrators dissolves into myth. Their decisions become timeless decrees, their limitations are forgotten. But the traces remain, embedded in language, ritual, and social structure. Humanity carries forward a memory it can no longer consciously access. A memory of being introduced into a system already under strain. This buried memory surfaces occasionally, in moments of crisis, when systems again approach their limits. Questions arise, doubts form. The old explanations feel insufficient, and beneath those doubts lies an older uncertainty, one inherited at the moment of creation. If our existence began a solution rather than intention, then what happens when the solution itself begins to fail? The tablets do not answer this. They move forward into the age of kings, of cities, of written law. Humanity steps fully into the foreground of history, but the shadow of that earlier world does not disappear. It lingers in the structure of labor, in the persistence of hierarchy, in the quiet sense that something foundational has been forgotten. And perhaps that is the most enduring consequence of what was transferred into humanity. Not life itself, but participation in a system whose origins are already slipping beyond reach. If that is so, then human history begins not with knowledge, but with inheritance. And inheritance, once severed from understanding, carries forward both continuity and loss in equal measure. As humanity settles into its role within the system, time begins to behave differently. The tablets, once concerned with deep cycles and administrative necessity, start to mark duration in a way that feels both precise and unsettling. Lists appear, sequences are recorded, reigns are counted, and suddenly, time stretches to a scale that resists ordinary comprehension. The earliest king lists describe rulers whose lifespans extend far beyond what biology would later permit. Tens of thousands of years are assigned to individual reigns, recorded without hesitation or apology. Modern readers often recoil at these numbers, instinctively searching for metaphor or scribal error. Yet the consistency of these figures across copies and regions suggests intention. Whatever these numbers represent, they were meant to convey something specific. It is tempting to interpret them as symbolic exaggeration, a way of expressing greatness rather than chronology, but symbolism usually varies. Here the pattern is stable, the numbers follow structure, they diminish over time, the reigns shorten gradually, not abruptly, as though history itself is compressing. This compression coincides with humanity's increasing prominence. As humans assume more responsibility within the system, time accelerates, memory fragments. What once unfolded over vast durations now occurs within generations. The long reigns belong to a pre-human or transitional era, one still touched by the Anunnaki's mode of existence. As their presence recedes, time collapses into human scale. The tablets do not explain the shift, they simply record it. Yet the implication is difficult to ignore. Time is not merely measured, it is experienced differently depending on one's position within the system. Those closer to the Anunnaki's domain exist within long cycles. Those embedded fully in the human condition live within brevity. This distinction echoes across cultures. Myths worldwide speak of an earlier age when beings lived longer, when gods walked among humans, when memory extended further back. Later ages are shorter, harsher, more forgetful. The Sumerian record preserves this transition not as mythic nostalgia, but as administrative fact. What changes is not only duration, but authority. Early kingship appears less like domination, and more like custodianship. Kings mediate between human labor and cosmic order. They maintain channels, enforce rituals, preserve balance. Their authority feels inherited rather than seized. Over time, however, kingship hardens, power concentrates, ritual becomes law, mediation turns into command, the long view fades, decisions are made for immediate stability rather than systemic continuity. This evolution mirrors the withdrawal of the Anunnaki. As oversight diminishes, humans fill the vacuum with structure. Hierarchy intensifies, memory is formalized into lists and decrees, replacing the earlier fluid understanding of cycles. The king lists themselves become tools of legitimacy. By anchoring authority in deep time, rulers align themselves with an old order they no longer fully comprehend. Longevity becomes proof of connection. Descent becomes justification. Yet the very act of listing betrays anxiety. One does not need to record what is unquestioned. The list suggests a need to stabilize memory as it begins to slip. Time is no longer experienced, it must be preserved artificially. This artificial preservation introduces distortion. Numbers become rigid. Context dissolves. The difference between reign and era blurs. What was once lived becomes counted. Scholars debate whether the long reigns represent dynasties rather than individuals, or symbolic units rather than years. These debates are necessary, but they may miss a quieter point. The lists are less concerned with accuracy than with continuity. They assert that authority existed long before current rulers and will continue after them. In doing so, they obscure a more uncomfortable truth: that the system once operated without human kings at all. The earliest sections of the list begin before the flood, before cities as later understood, before stable human institutions. They gesture toward an era where authority did not arise from conquest or inheritance, but from function within a larger order. As humanity becomes fully central, this functional authority transforms into political authority. The difference is subtle but profound. Function responds to necessity. Politics responds to control. This shift alters how imbalance is addressed. Where earlier adjustments were systemic, later responses become punitive. Floods are no longer pressures within a cycle. They are punishments for disobedience. Droughts become signs of moral failure rather than signals of strain. The Anunnaki, now distant, are invoked as judges rather than administrators. Their earlier fatigue is forgotten, their limitations erased. What remains is an image of absolute power, wielded in response to human behavior. This reinterpretation comforts and frightens in equal measure. It explains suffering while placing responsibility squarely on human shoulders. The system itself is absolved, yet the cracks remain. The king lists, with their impossible durations, resist full assimilation into this moral framework. They whisper of another mode of existence, one not governed by guilt or virtue but by balance and capacity. Time, in this earlier mode, was expansive. It allowed for correction without catastrophe. In human time, correction is compressed. Consequences arrive swiftly. Memory struggles to keep pace. This compression may explain the growing emphasis on prophecy and omen reading in later periods. When long-term cycles become inaccessible, attention shifts to signs. The future is read in fragments rather than patterns. The Anunnaki's earlier role as stewards of cycles dissolves into a more abstract guardianship of fate. Humanity, lacking the deep temporal perspective, seeks reassurance through prediction, and prediction, by its nature, reveals uncertainty. The transition from long reigns to short ones marks more than a change in leadership. It marks a change in how existence itself is understood. The world is no longer something to be maintained patiently over immense spans. It becomes something to be survived from generation to generation. This survival mindset intensifies hierarchy. It sharpens boundaries. It prioritizes immediacy over continuity. The system still exists, but its horizon narrows. The tablets do not condemn this narrowing, they simply trace it. And in doing so, they preserve a memory of time before urgency, before scarcity felt permanent, before human mortality defined the rhythm of decision-making. That memory does not disappear entirely. It lingers in ritual, in architecture aligned to cycles longer than a lifetime, in myths that speak of return rather than end. But it no longer governs daily action. The Anunnaki's deep time perspective fades into background hum. Humanity moves forward within shorter loops, repeating patterns without always recognizing them. This repetition gives rise to the sense of recurrence that haunts later histories, the feeling that civilizations rise and fall according to rules never fully articulated. Perhaps those rules once belonged to a system designed for endurance rather than dominance. If so, then the shortening of reigns is not simply a loss of longevity. It is a loss of patience, a loss of perspective, a contraction of time that reshapes every choice made within it. The question that follows is not whether the long reigns were literal. It is what kind of world could imagine them as normal. And if such a world once existed, one where authority operated across immense spans, what traces of its logic remain embedded within the structures humanity continues to inherit? The lists do not answer this. They simply end their long durations and move on, as if acknowledging that whatever came before can no longer be fully recovered. That the compression of time leaves an imprint, and that imprint shapes how humanity will respond when the system strains again. Because when time feels short, decisions grow sharper. And when decisions grow sharper, the margin for error narrows. What happens next unfolds within that narrowing margin, where memory fades faster than consequence, and where the long view has already begun to slip out of reach. When the strain returns, it does not announce itself as novelty. It arrives as repetition. The tablets shift their attention from reigns and lists to a disturbance that feels both inevitable and familiar, as though the system has reached a pressure point it has touched before. Water rises, boundaries dissolve, memory fractures along fault lines already weakened by time. The flood is never introduced as a singular event in the deepest layers of the tradition. It appears instead as a pattern, one interruption among others, distinguished not by its existence, but by its scale. The language surrounding it is careful, almost restrained. There is no indulgence in spectacle. The emphasis lies on reset rather than destruction. This matters. Catastrophes that are remembered as moral judgments tend to be narrated loudly. They explain themselves. The flood, as preserved in the older strata, does not. It unfolds as consequence rather than punishment. An accumulation releases. A system clears itself. The Anunnaki, now distant but not absent, are implicated less as avengers than as observers of necessity. Their earlier role as administrators lingers in the background. Decisions are made, but the tone lacks outrage. What is conveyed is resignation, the sense that imbalance, once allowed to accumulate, must resolve somewhere. Geological memory aligns uncomfortably well with this intuition. Long before written history, the Earth experienced sudden inundations, meltwater pulses, rapid sea level rise, catastrophic river floods as ice dams failed. These events were not singular. They recurred. They reshaped coastlines and erased settlements without regard for human intention. The tablets do not document these processes scientifically, but they echo their logic. Water is not evil. It is corrective. It returns the system to an earlier state, clearing accumulation, redistributing matter, resetting conditions. What survives the flood is as important as what does not. Survival is not framed as reward. It is selective, functional. Seeds are preserved. Knowledge is carried forward in fragments. The system does not begin anew. It resumes. This resumption reveals something essential about the Anunnaki's absence. They do not intervene to prevent the flood, nor do they remain fully present to guide their recovery. Their withdrawal has reached a point where correction proceeds without direct oversight. Humanity, now fully embedded in the system, experiences the flood not as adjustment, but as rupture. Time breaks, lineage fragments, memory compresses violently. What was once cyclical now feels terminal. In this compression, interpretation changes. The flood becomes moralized. Survival becomes favor. Loss becomes guilt. The human need for explanation fills the vacuum left by the Anunnaki's retreat. Yet beneath this moral overlay, the older pattern remains visible. The flood does not end the system, it recalibrates it. The same pressures that once led to humanity's introduction now express themselves through erasure and renewal. This recurrence suggests that the system's limits were never fully resolved. Humanity alleviated labor, but introduced new forms of accumulation. Population grows. Landscapes are altered. Channels multiply. The Earth's burden shifts but does not disappear. The flood, then, is not failure. It is maintenance at scale. This interpretation unsettles later traditions that frame history as linear progress interrupted by divine wrath. The Sumerian memory is less dramatic. It portrays history as oscillation, expansion followed by contraction, build-up followed by release. In this oscillation, memory becomes unreliable. Each reset strips context. What survives is simplified, ritualized, and retold. The deeper logic fades with each cycle. This fading explains the strange duality of flood narratives across cultures. They preserve technical details, boats, seeds, measurements, alongside moral lessons that feel imposed after the fact. The procedure remains, the explanation changes. The Anunnaki's role in this moment is telling precisely because it is understated. They are not center stage. Their earlier fatigue and withdrawal have consequences. Without constant oversight, correction becomes blunt. The system does not negotiate with humanity. It acts. After the flood, the world feels different. Not only physically, but temporally. Time accelerates further. Lifespans shorten again. Authority concentrates. Memory is guarded more tightly, now recognized as fragile. Human institutions respond by codifying what remains. Writing intensifies, law solidifies, ritual becomes rigid. Flexibility, once possible within long cycles, gives way to control. This response is understandable. When context is lost, preservation becomes priority. But preservation without comprehension introduces rigidity. The system continues, but with reduced capacity to adapt gently. The flood marks a threshold where humanity assumes not only labor, but stewardship without guidance. The Anunnaki's earlier presence had allowed for adjustment within wide margins. Their absence narrows those margins. The tablets hint at this narrowing through changes in tone. Earlier passages breathe, later ones tighten. There is urgency now. Omen lists expand. Anxiety grows. The earth, once a managed environment, becomes a source of threat. Water, once directed, becomes feared. Nature is no longer collaborator, it is judge. This shift alters humanity's relationship to the system it inhabits. Fear replaces negotiation. Appeasement replaces adjustment. The logic of cycles is replaced by the hope of exemption. Yet the cycles persist regardless of interpretation. The flood's memory embeds itself deeply into human consciousness, not because it was unique, but because it coincided with a profound loss of understanding. It marks the moment when humanity realizes, perhaps unconsciously, that it no longer knows how the system truly works. From this point forward, history becomes reactive. Humanity responds to signs rather than patterns. It builds defenses rather than balances. It seeks permanence in a world defined by return. The Anunnaki recede further into myth, invoked in ritual but absent from process. Their earlier role as mediators between earth and system is replaced by abstract authority. And with abstraction comes distance. The further removed authority becomes, the harsher its imagined judgments grow. Floods become punishments. Droughts become warnings. The system is no longer understood as strained, but as offended. This misinterpretation has consequences. It reshapes ethics, governance, and belief. It narrows the scope of possible response. Yet beneath these layers, the older memory persists, faint but intact. The flood was not the end. It was not even exceptional. It was one correction among many, amplified by timing and circumstance. If that is so, then the most important question is not why the flood happened, but why its meaning shifted so dramatically in human memory. Perhaps the answer lies in the Anunnaki's retreat. Without those who once understood the system's limits, humanity is left to interpret pressure through the lens of agency and blame. And perhaps this is the true inheritance of the flood. Not destruction, but misunderstanding. The tablets do not resolve this. They move on, into a world rebuilding itself with partial knowledge and heightened fear. Humanity continues, resilient yet altered, carrying forward a system it no longer fully recognizes. What remains unasked, lingering beneath the narrative, is whether the system itself ever intended to be understood by those who now maintain it, and if understanding was once possible only under the guidance of those who have since withdrawn, then what does it mean to inherit a world whose operating logic has already slipped beyond reach? The flood recedes, the waters withdraw, but the loss of context does not. It settles quietly into the foundation of everything that follows, shaping decisions, beliefs, and structures long after the surface appears dry again. And as the system resumes its cycles, one cannot help but wonder whether the next correction is already forming, unrecognized, accumulating, waiting for another threshold to be crossed. After the waters recede, the world does not return to what it was. It cannot. Something essential has shifted, not only in the landscape but in the way memory itself is handled. The tablets begin to reflect a new anxiety, quiet, persistent, and structural. Knowledge is no longer assumed to flow naturally through time. It must be guarded, filtered, and preserved with intention. This is where silence becomes deliberate. In the earlier layers, memory felt expansive. Stories carried weight without needing explanation. Processes were implied rather than justified. After the flood, this ease disappears. What survives does so unevenly. Fragments remain intact while entire contexts vanish. Humanity inherits not a continuous narrative, but a patchwork of remnants. The response to this fragmentation is subtle, but decisive. Knowledge begins to centralize. Temples grow heavier with responsibility. Priesthoods emerge not merely as ritual specialists, but as custodians of memory. What was once shared through participation is now mediated through authority. This mediation changes the character of remembrance. The tablets no longer speak freely of uncertainty. Ambiguity becomes dangerous. When survival feels precarious, clarity is preferred, even if that clarity is constructed. Stories are streamlined, contradictions are softened. The past is shaped to serve stability rather than accuracy. This is not deception in the modern sense. It is adaptation. A system that has lost its deeper logic compensates by narrowing the range of acceptable interpretation. The Anunnaki, already distant, are now preserved primarily through sanctioned narratives. The earlier fatigue, debate, and limitation fade further into obscurity. What remains is power without context, authority without process. In this environment, forgetting becomes functional. Certain details simply do not serve the emerging order. The idea that the gods once labored is destabilizing. The notion that humanity was introduced as a solution to systemic strain undermines later claims of divine favor. These elements recede, not through erasure, but through neglect. Silence performs its work patiently. What replaces these older memories is structure, lineage, hierarchy. The emphasis shifts from why the system exists to who controls it. Kingship aligns itself ever more tightly with divine mandate. To question the gods becomes to question the state. This alignment is efficient. It reduces uncertainty. It channels obedience, but it comes at a cost. Inquiry narrows. Speculation becomes suspect. The space once occupied by curiosity collapses into doctrine. The tablets themselves reflect this transition. Earlier texts wonder, later ones instruct. Ritual prescriptions multiply. Deviations are corrected. The tone hardens. Humanity, now fully responsible for maintaining order, becomes wary of destabilizing questions. Memory is curated to prevent recurrence of catastrophe, even if that curation distorts the past. This distortion is subtle. It does not invent new events. It reinterprets existing ones. The flood becomes punishment rather than correction. Creation becomes blessing rather than intervention. The Anunnaki become eternal rather than constrained. Each shift brings comfort, but also distance from the original logic. Language plays a central role in this process. A Sumerian gives way to Akkadian and later tongues. Translation smooths irregularities. Words with multiple meanings are fixed into single interpretations. What was once flexible becomes rigid. This rigidity protects order, but it also locks misunderstanding in place. The Anunnaki, now translated through lenses that favor transcendence, lose their earlier embeddedness in the system. Their decisions appear absolute rather than situational. Their withdrawal is reframed as intentional distance rather than consequence. Humanity's role, correspondingly, is elevated. Labor becomes service. Obligation becomes purpose. What began as necessity is recast as destiny. This recasting is powerful. It gives meaning to suffering. It justifies hierarchy. It transforms endurance into virtue. Yet beneath this new narrative, old tensions remain unresolved. The system still strains. Imbalance still accumulates. But without the conceptual framework to recognize these pressures as systemic, responses become moral rather than practical. When droughts return, prayers intensify. When floods threaten again, sacrifices multiply. Appeasement replaces adjustment. The Anunnaki, now fully abstracted, cannot correct this misunderstanding. Their earlier role required presence. Without it, humanity navigates blind. This blindness manifests not as ignorance, but as overconfidence. Systems harden, institutions grow brittle. Flexibility, once the system's strength, diminishes. Ironically, the effort to preserve order makes the system more fragile. The tablets preserve hints of dissent. Occasional laments speak of gods who no longer listen. Complaints surface about rituals that fail to bring relief. These voices are quiet but persistent. They suggest an awareness, however faint, that something essential has been lost. A loss is not belief, but comprehension. Humanity continues to act within the system, maintaining it through labor and ritual, but the original rationale for those actions has faded. Meaning is inherited, not understood. This inheritance shapes culture profoundly. Art becomes symbolic rather than procedural. Architecture aligns to cycles whose purpose is no longer fully grasped. Time is marked meticulously, even as its deeper patterns slip away. The Anunnaki's memory becomes layered. At the surface, they are gods. Beneath that, echoes of administrators remain, visible only in inconsistencies, in moments where myth fails to fully cohere. These inconsistencies are often dismissed as errors or embellishments, but they may be the most faithful remnants of the older story. They point to a time when authority was negotiated rather than absolute, when creation was pragmatic rather than celebratory, when humanity entered an already strained system rather than inheriting a perfected world. To preserve order, the story had to be simplified. Complexity invites doubt. Doubt invites instability. And so forgetting becomes an act of preservation. Yet forgetting is never complete. It leaves traces, it produces unease, it generates questions that resurface across generations, phrased differently but rooted in the same uncertainty. Why does the world feel demanding rather than benevolent? Why does labor define existence? Why do cycles repeat despite ritual effort? These questions linger beneath doctrine, surfacing in philosophy and poetry in quiet moments of reflection. The tablets do not answer them. They show us the mechanism by which such questions were once contained, then released. The Anunnaki, in withdrawing, left humanity not only with responsibility, but with incomplete knowledge of the system it must sustain. That incompleteness shapes every response that follows. History, from this point forward, becomes a series of attempts to stabilize a world whose original logic is no longer accessible. And perhaps this is the deepest silence embedded in the texts, not the absence of information, but the absence of permission to ask what came before the asking itself. As memory narrows and authority solidifies, the space for such inquiry shrinks, but it does not vanish entirely. It waits, and in waiting it exerts pressure of its own, building slowly, quietly, until the system once again approaches a threshold. What happens when that threshold is reached without the guidance of those who once understood its limits remains an open question. One the tablets leave unresolved, hanging between what was remembered and what was deliberately allowed to fade. As memory narrows and authority solidifies, attention shifts upward. The sky, once a field of cycles observed and adjusted, becomes a source of messages rather than mechanisms. The tablets begin to speak more frequently of signs, of movements overhead that carry meaning beyond their motion. Heaven and earth, once described as interlocking systems, start to drift apart in understanding. Earlier the sky was structured, paths were known, motions repeated with reliability that allowed for planning rather than the interpretation. Celestial bodies were not omens by default, they were components. Their movements informed timing, balance, and coordination within the larger system. Observation served maintenance. But as the Anunnaki withdraw and comprehension fades, observation transforms into divination. The same stars that once marked cycles now announce favor or displeasure. Eclipses, once predictable, become warnings. The sky no longer explains itself, it must be read. This shift is subtle in the texts, but unmistakable. Lists of stars give way to lists of portents. Description yields to prescription. The heavens are no longer a system humanity participates in, but a message humanity must decipher. This transformation mirrors what happens whenever operational knowledge becomes inaccessible. Function is replaced by symbolism, understanding by interpretation, control by hope. The Anunnaki, once associated with the administration of cosmic order, are now repositioned as watchers. Their presence is inferred through signs rather than actions. They do not adjust, they observe. They do not intervene, they judge. This reframing alters humanity's relationship with both sky and earth. Instead of negotiating balance through adjustment, humans attempt to secure outcomes through alignment. Ritual becomes a way of speaking upward rather than acting within. The Watchers, as they are increasingly imagined, embody this distance. They see, but do not labor. They know, but do not explain. Their authority rests in observation rather than participation. This is a profound departure from the earlier memory. The Anunnaki were once defined by dissent, by engagement with complexity. Now they ascend into abstraction, their involvement reduced to surveillance. The consequences of this shift ripple outward. Astronomy flourishes, but its purpose changes. Precision increases, but understanding narrows. Charts map the sky with remarkable accuracy, yet interpretation drifts toward fate rather than function. Humanity becomes intensely attentive to patterns it no longer believes it can influence. This attentiveness breeds both insight and anxiety. The sky feels close, intimate, filled with meaning. At the same time, it feels unreachable. Humanity watches but does not touch, observes but does not adjust. The earth, meanwhile, continues to strain under accumulation. Agriculture intensifies, cities expand, resources concentrate. The system demands more coordination than ever before, yet the conceptual tools for adjustment have been replaced by appeals. This mismatch deepens unease. When imbalance occurs, humans look upward rather than inward. Signs are sought, causes are externalized. The tablets preserve traces of this tension. Omen texts proliferate alongside laments. Kings seek reassurance through astrology. Decisions hinge on celestial alignment, rather than material assessment. This reliance is not irrational. In a world where deeper systemic understanding has been lost, the sky offers consistency. Its cycles endure even as earthly structures falter. It becomes a mirror of order humanity hopes to recover. Yet hope is not control. The Watchers, as imagined, do not respond predictably. Signs conflict. Interpretations vary. Authority fragments among those who claim expertise in reading the heavens. This fragmentation introduces competition. Knowledge becomes power. Access to interpretation confers influence. The priesthood's role intensifies, not as mediators of process, but as translators of divine will. Translation, however, always involves choice. As interpretations diverge, doctrine hardens. Disagreement becomes threat. Certainty is enforced where understanding is lacking. The system grows more rigid in response to ambiguity. The Anunnaki's earlier complexity would not fit easily here. Their fatigue, their debates, Their adjustments contradict the image of distant, perfect watchers. These elements fade further into silence. What remains is a simplified cosmology that prioritizes authority over adaptability. And yet the sky itself resists simplification. Its cycles persist regardless of interpretation. Eclipses recur, planets wander, patterns repeat with stubborn regularity. This regularity occasionally breaks through the interpretive layer, reminding observers that the heavens operate according to rules independent of human meaning. When predictions fail, anxiety spikes, explanations are revised. The tension between pattern and interpretation never fully resolves. In quiet moments, the older memory stirs. Astronomers note cycles too precise to be purely symbolic. Architects align structures to solstices whose significance extends beyond ritual. Farmers rely on stars for timing even as priests speak of fate. These practices hint at a residual understanding, a sense that the sky is more than a message, that it once functioned as part of a system humanity engaged with directly. But without the Anunnaki's guiding presence, this engagement remains partial. Humanity can observe, but not fully integrate. The watchers, as an idea, become both comforting and constraining. Comforting because they imply order and oversight. Constraining because they discourage intervention. If the heavens judge, then human agency diminishes. Responsibility shifts upward. The system's strain is attributed to favor rather than structure. This attribution reshapes ethics. Obedience becomes paramount. Innovation becomes suspect. Stability is sought through conformity rather than adaptation. The tablets record the consequences obliquely. Periods of prosperity alternate with collapse. Cities rise and fall. Each collapse is interpreted anew, rarely a systemic overload. The pattern repeats. The watchers remain silent. In this silence, humanity's relationship to time and space continues to contract. Decisions prioritize immediacy. Long-term balance becomes abstract. The deep cycles once managed through adjustment now unfold without coordination. The Anunnaki's earlier role as mediators between heaven and earth is fully mythologized. Their descent is remembered, if at all, as metaphor. Their administration becomes miracle, yet the structural memory persists, embedded in architecture, calendar, and ritual rhythm. Humanity continues to act as though the world is part of a larger mechanism, even as it lacks the language to describe that mechanism accurately. This dissonance defines the age that follows. An age of watching without understanding, of interpreting without adjusting, of seeking permission where once there was participation. The sky remains vast and ordered. The earth remains demanding and strained. Humanity stands between them, attentive but uncertain, carrying forward a system whose original logic has been obscured by distance and time. The tablets do not lament this condition. They simply trace its emergence, as if aware that such narrowing is itself part of the cycle. If the watchers still observe, they do so from a distance that no longer allows for correction through dialogue. And if humanity continues to look upward for answers, it may miss the quieter signals rising from the system it inhabits. The question that lingers, unresolved and persistent, is whether watching alone is enough to sustain balance, or whether a system once designed for participation can endure when participation is replaced by interpretation. The sky continues to move, the earth continues to bear weight, and somewhere between them, a species listens for signs, uncertain whether the silence above is judgment, withdrawal, or simply the absence of those who once knew how to intervene. When humanity begins to search beyond its own memory, it does not look forward, it looks sideways. Across land and sea, fragments of the same unease appear in different forms, as if cultures separated by distance are remembering the same pressure from different angles. The tablets no longer stand alone. Their themes echo elsewhere, altered by geography but familiar in structure. Stories emerge of earlier ages when beings unlike humans shaped the world. When order was established before people learned to name themselves. In the valleys of distant rivers, in high plateaus, in islands scattered across oceans, similar memories surface. Not identical, but aligned. They speak of descent, of instruction, of withdrawal, of a time when humanity was not alone, and not yet central. What is striking is not the surface similarity of these stories but their shared omissions. They rarely explain why these earlier beings acted as they did. They rarely describe their origins. They arrive already formed, already engaged, already burdened. Humanity enters later, often abruptly, often as helper or inheritor. These parallels have long been dismissed as coincidence or diffusion. Trade routes, migration, shared psychology. And yet, the deeper one looks, the more those explanations strain. The patterns recur even where context is unlikely. The logic aligns even where symbolism diverges. Across cultures, creation is often framed not as celebration, but as response. Something is wrong. Something is heavy. Something requires adjustment. Humanity appears not as culmination but as intervention. The names change, the forms shift, but the structure remains. In some traditions, these earlier beings are remembered as civilizers, bringing knowledge and withdrawing once order is established. In others, they are remembered as rulers whose absence leaves humanity adrift. In still others, they are recast as enemies, their memories sharpened into warning. These differences matter less than the shared tension beneath them, a sense that humanity inherited a world already shaped by forces it no longer fully understands. This inheritance produces anxiety. Cultures attempt to resolve it in different ways. Some emphasize obedience, aligning themselves with the perceived will of absent authorities. Others emphasize mastery, seeking to replace what was lost through technology and organization. Still others retreat into cyclical cosmologies, accepting repetition as inevitable. Yet none of these approaches fully restores the earlier balance. The Anunnaki, as remembered in Sumer, occupy a particular position within this broader pattern. They are neither purely benevolent nor overtly hostile. They are administrators. Their withdrawal is not framed as punishment, but as consequence. This nuance is rare. Many traditions simplify the departure of earlier beings into moral narrative. Banishment, betrayal, fall. The Sumerian memory remains stubbornly procedural. It suggests that withdrawal occurred because the system changed, not because humanity failed. This distinction is crucial. It implies that humanity's current condition is not the result of era, but of transition. We live within a phase shaped by structural necessity rather than moral judgment. Across cultures, similar transitions are marked by floods, fires, or collapses. These events reset conditions and compress memory. What follows is a world that remembers just enough to feel haunted, but not enough to understand why. The recurrence of flood narratives is particularly telling, not because floods are rare, but because they are remembered as thresholds. Before the flood, time is long, beings are different, communication flows. After the flood, time shortens, authority centralizes, and memory fragments. This pattern suggests that humanity's relationship to his own past is shaped less by gradual forgetting than by sudden compression. Knowledge is not lost evenly, it is sheared. In the aftermath, cultures rebuild with what remains. They fill gaps with explanation. They assign intent where context is gone. They create gods who judge rather than systems that strain. The Anunnaki's later portrayal as distant overseers fits neatly into this pattern. As their administrative role fades from memory, their authority becomes absolute. Absolute authority is easier to reconcile with loss than negotiated responsibility. Yet the cost of this reconciliation is adaptability. When systems are understood as moral rather than mechanical, responses to stress become limited. Appeasement replaces adjustment. Sacrifice replaces redistribution. Prayer replaces analysis. These responses provide meaning, but not relief. The parallels across cultures suggest that this shift is not unique to Sumer. It is a recurring outcome when humanity inherits responsibility without comprehension. When the deeper logic of a system is lost, meaning rushes in to fill the void. Meaning stabilizes, but it also constrains. The persistence of similar myths across continents hints at a shared human condition rather than shared origin. Humanity, everywhere, appears to grapple with the same inheritance. A world already structured, already demanding, already prone to correction. The Anunnaki are one expression of this inheritance. They represent a memory of involvement before abstraction, of authority before transcendence. Their uniqueness lies not in their strangeness, but in how clearly they preserve the transition. Most traditions blur the moment where administration becomes divinity. Sumer's tablets linger there, briefly, uncomfortably. They show gods who work, who tire, who debate. Then they show those same gods receding, hardening, becoming something else. This lingering makes the loss visible. As humanity spreads, these patterns re-emerge. New civilizations rise atop older foundations, often unaware of what lies beneath. Ruins accumulate, cities are rebuilt. Each layer carries traces of previous systems, partially understood, partially misinterpreted. Archaeology reveals this layering physically. Myth reveals it symbolically. The Anunnaki, when viewed through this lens, are not anomalies. They are placeholders for a broader truth. That humanity did not begin history from zero. It entered midstream, inheriting structures shaped by pressures no longer visible. This truth unsettles because it undermines narratives of progress. It suggests that advancement does not guarantee understanding, and that complexity can be lost as easily as it is gained. Across cultures, there is a recurring sense that something important was once known and is now forgotten. This sense drives philosophy, religion, and science alike. It motivates the search for origins, for first principles, for hidden laws. But the search often looks in the wrong direction. It seeks beginnings rather than transitions. The tablet suggests that the critical moment was not creation, but handover. Not the making of humanity, but the withdrawal of those who once understood the system's limits. If this is so, then humanity shared myths are not echoes of a single event, but responses to a shared condition. Each culture grapples with the same absence, the same narrowing of perspective, the same pressure to maintain balance without guidance. The Anunnaki's story resonates because it names this condition without resolving it. It preserves the discomfort rather than smoothing it away. This preservation allows the question to persist. What kind of world requires constant maintenance, yet gradually withdraws its maintainers? And what does it mean to be a species that steps into such a role without full awareness of what that role entails? Across continents and centuries, humanity keeps asking versions of this question, even when it no longer remembers why. The answers diverge, the pressure remains. Perhaps this is why the memory of earlier beings never fully disappears. It resurfaces whenever systems strain, whenever balance falters, whenever progress reveals its limits. The Anunnaki are remembered not because they were gods, but because they represent a moment when responsibility shifted without complete understanding. And as humanity continues to inherit the consequences of that shift, the quiet recognition grows that the story is not finished. The parallels across cultures do not offer resolution, they offer continuity. They suggest that humanity's struggle to understand its place within a larger system is ongoing, recurring, unresolved. And if so, then the question is not whether the Anunnaki existed as beings or symbols, but why the memory of such figures persists so stubbornly across time and space. What absence are they pointing to? What role are they reminding us we have inherited but never fully learned how to perform? The tablets do not answer. They simply align with countless other voices, each whispering the same uncertainty from different shores, and in that alignment another layer of the mystery quietly opens. As the echoes from distant cultures converge, another pressure begins to surface, one quieter, less visible, but no less decisive. It lives not in floods or rains or stars, but in language itself. The tablets, once carriers of layered meaning, now pass through hands that must choose how much ambiguity to allow. And in those choices, something subtle happens to memory. Translation is never neutral. Each rendering settles questions the original left open. Each decision narrows a field of possible meanings into a single path. Over centuries, a Sumerian gives way to Akkadian, an Akkadian to later scholarly tongues. Uncertainty is gradually trimmed away, not out of malice, but out of need. Ambiguity destabilizes authority. The earliest texts tolerate it. They allow contradictions to coexist. They do not insist on coherence. A god may tire in one passage and command eternally in another. A decision may feel provisional here and absolute there. These tensions are not resolved. They are preserved. Later translations struggle with this tolerance. They prefer clarity. Fatigue becomes metaphor. Debate becomes decree. What once felt procedural hardens into doctrine. The Anunnaki are particularly affected by this process. The name itself resists fixation, carrying connotations of descent, lineage, authority, and place. Early on, these layers overlap. Later, one meaning is chosen and elevated, while others recede into footnotes. What is lost in this elevation is process. Words that once implied action, carrying, shaping, assigning, are softened into abstraction. The Anunnaki's work becomes will. Their adjustment becomes intention. Their limitation disappears behind omnipotence. This shift is subtle, but its consequences are profound. Once authority is understood as absolute rather than situational, the system's earlier flexibility vanishes. Adaptation gives way to obedience. Humanity's role shifts accordingly. If gods no longer adjust systems, humans no longer adjust either. They comply. They endure. They interpret suffering as meaningful rather than mechanical. Translation reinforces this worldview by selecting meanings that support stability. Terms that suggest contingency are rendered as destiny. Phrases that imply negotiation are rendered as command. What once described a working system now describes an ordered universe. This ordering is comforting. It reduces cognitive strain. It offers explanation without requiring structural insight. But it also locks misunderstanding into place. The tablets themselves bear scars of this process. Variations appear between copies. Passages are omitted or rearranged. Scribal glosses creep into the text, clarifying what was once left open. These clarifications are not necessarily wrong. They are simply final. Finality changes how stories function. An open narrative invites participation. A closed one demands assent. The Anunnaki's earlier portrayal as administrators depended on openness. It allowed for error, debate, and adjustment. Once closed, that portrayal becomes untenable. Administrators can fail. Gods, as later imagined, cannot. And so failure must be reassigned. Human suffering becomes deserved. Floods become warnings. Collapse becomes consequence of disobedience rather than overload. The system absolves itself. This absolution reshapes ethics. Responsibility moves from structure to individual behavior. Balance becomes moral rather than mechanical. The shift is not complete, nor is it uniform. Pockets of older understanding persist. Astronomers still calculate cycles. Engineers still manage water. Farmers still read seasons. But these practices coexist uneasily with doctrines that frame outcomes as judgment. The result is a divided worldview. One part of culture operates pragmatically, another interprets symbolically. Tension arises when these modes conflict. Translation mediates this conflict by privileging one mode over the other. Over time, the symbolic gains prominence. The practical recedes into craft, separated from meaning. This separation deepens humanity's sense of alienation from the system it maintains. Work becomes toil rather than participation. Ritual becomes obligation rather than coordination. The Anunnaki's earlier involvement in labor is no longer imaginable within this framework. Gods who toil undermine transcendence, and transcendence has become necessary to support hierarchy. Thus, earlier descriptions of divine fatigue are reinterpreted or ignored. They do not fit. What remains are fragments, odd phrases, inconsistent tones, moments where the narrative seems to hesitate. These are often treated as errors or embellishments, but they may be the most faithful remnants of an earlier understanding. They point to a time when meaning was not yet settled, when authority was exercised within constraints, when the system was acknowledged as demanding rather than benevolent. Translation, in narrowing meaning, protects stability at the cost of adaptability. It creates a past that supports the present, rather than one that challenges it. This process continues into modern scholarship, though in subtler form. Debates arise over literal versus metaphorical readings, over myth versus history, over belief versus psychology. These debates often circle the same absence without naming it. They ask what the texts say, but not why certain possibilities were allowed to disappear. The Anunnaki story sits at the center of this absence. It resists complete domestication. Even heavily translated, it retains a procedural texture that feels out of place within later theological systems. This texture unsettles. It suggests that the world was once managed rather than ordained, adjusted rather than judged. It implies that suffering arises from imbalance rather than sin. Such implications are destabilizing. They challenge narratives of control. They invite structural critique rather than moral conformity, and so they are often softened. Yet softening does not erase, it layers. Beneath the polished surface of later translations, the older logic remains faintly visible, like a palimpsest. Scholars notice it. Readers feel it. Something does not quite align. This misalignment fuels speculation. Some push toward literalism, imagining advanced beings or technologies. Others retreat into symbolism, dissolving discomfort into allegory. Both approaches attempt to resolve tension by choosing certainty. The tablets themselves resist this resolution. They preserve uncertainty as feature, not flaw. They allow the Anunnaki to be both powerful and constrained, both authoritative and burdened. Translation, by contrast, seeks to decide. The cost of decision is loss of depth. Once meaning is fixed, alternative interpretations vanish from practice. Inquiry narrows, memory hardens. This hardening has long-term effects. It shapes how humanity responds to strain. When systems falter, the instinct is to seek moral cores rather than structural adjustment. This instinct perpetuates imbalance. It treats symptoms rather than conditions. The Anunnaki's withdrawal, compounded by translation's narrowing, leaves humanity managing a system it no longer recognizes as such. The world becomes stage rather than mechanism. Yet the mechanism continues to operate. Earth still demands maintenance. Cycles still recur. Accumulation still reaches thresholds. Corrections still occur. When they do, humanity interprets them through the lens available. Judgment, fate, destiny, rather than capacity and strain. This interpretation offers meaning, but not solution.
The tablets do not correct this misunderstanding. They simply preserve the moment where it began, where language started to settle what had once been fluid. In that settling, humanity gained certainty and lost flexibility. The Anunnaki, once participants in adjustment, became symbols of perfection. and perfection, once imagined, leaves little room for negotiation. What remains is a system running on inherited assumptions, maintained through ritual and belief, increasingly disconnected from the practical logic that once governed it. The question that lingers beneath the layers of translation is not whether the Anunnaki were real or symbolic, but whether the narrowing of meaning has limited humanity's ability to recognize when systems strain again. If the past has been simplified to preserve order, what tools remain to address imbalance when order itself becomes the source of pressure? The tablets offer no answer. They simply reveal the narrowing in progress, leaving us to wonder what possibilities were left behind when ambiguity was traded for certainty, and whether those possibilities might still matter when the system approaches its next threshold. As meanings harden and language settles into certainty, another transformation unfolds quietly, almost invisibly. Authority, once dispersed across roles and processes, begins to gather itself into fewer hands. What had been mediated through systems becomes embodied in institutions, and institutions by their nature seek permanence. The tablets reflect this shift not through proclamation, but through emphasis. Names recur, lineages are traced, offices solidify. The world that once required continual adjustment now appears governed by fixed order. The Anunnaki, long withdrawn from direct involvement, remain present only as distant guarantors of legitimacy. Their absence becomes useful. When authority no longer negotiates with the system, it claims to represent it. Kings rule by divine sanction rather than functional competence. Priests interpret will rather than manage balance. The logic of administration gives way to the logic of representation. This shift is subtle but decisive. It changes what power means. In earlier memory, authority responded to strain. It adjusted flows, redistributed labour, recalibrated cycles. Now authority asserts itself as origin rather than response. It claims to know rather than to listen. The Anunnaki, reframed as perfect and remote, serve this transformation well.
That distance absolves institutions of accountability. If order descends from above, then failure must rise from below. Humanity internalizes this logic. Obedience replaces participation. Compliance replaces adjustment. Stability becomes virtue. Yet stability achieved through rigidity carries hidden cost. A system continues to change regardless of institutional claims. Earth responds to accumulation. Climate shifts. Resources deplete. Population pressures mount. But institutions trained to preserve order resist acknowledging systemic strain. Instead, they seek to reinforce hierarchy. This reinforcement appears in law codes, ritual precision, and architectural grandeur. Structures grow monumental, projecting permanence in a world that resists it. Stone replaces clay, decree replaces discussion. The Anunnaki's earlier role as administrators fades completely from lived memory. Their legacy survives only as abstraction, names invoked, not processes recalled. Authority no longer imagines itself as caretaker, but as sovereign. Sovereignty changes how problems are addressed. Where administrators once adjusted systems, sovereigns demand loyalty. Where correction once involved redistribution, it now involves punishment. This shift is not born of cruelty, it is born of fear. Institutions fear instability more than imbalance. Instability threatens legitimacy. Imbalance threatens function. When legitimacy takes precedence, function is sacrificed. The tablets preserve this tension in quiet ways. Complaints surface about injustice. Laments speak of gods who no longer answer. There is a growing sense that ritual compliance does not restore balance. Yet dissent remains muted. The system discourages questioning the framework itself. To question the gods is to question the state. To question the state is to invite chaos, and chaos, in a world haunted by flood and collapse, is unthinkable. Thus, authority tightens, memory narrows further. The space for alternative interpretation shrinks. What remains is a brittle order, impressive in form, fragile in operation. The Anunnaki, now fully symbolic, can no longer intervene even if they once did. Their withdrawal is complete. Humanity stands alone within the system, yet continues to act as though guidance remains. This dissonance creates strain of its own. Without adaptive oversight, systems rely on inertia. They persist until they fail. When failure arrives, it is sudden, catastrophic, and often misattributed. Collapse is blamed on moral decay, foreign influence, insufficient devotion. Rarely is it traced to accumulation or rigidity. The tablets hint at cycles of rise and fall without naming their causes directly. Cities flourish, then vanish. Names end abruptly. Dynasties terminate without explanation. Archaeology later reveals layers of abandonment, salinized fields, shifting rivers. The physical record speaks of strain. The textual record speaks of fate. This divergence reveals the cost of transformed authority. When systems are interpreted morally, their material limits are ignored. The Anunnaki's earlier memory of fatigue and constraint could have offered a different model, one where even those in authority acknowledged limits. But that memory has been rendered incompatible with institutional needs. Institutions require certainty. They require permanence. They require symbols that do not age. The Anunnaki, once participants in adjustment, become such symbols. Their perfection becomes justification. Their silence becomes consent. Humanity inherits not only the system, but the burden of maintaining legitimacy in a changing world. When legitimacy conflicts with adaptation, adaptation loses. This pattern repeats across time. New empires rise atop old foundations, each claiming divine sanction, each resisting acknowledgement of structural limits. Each inherits the same narrowing of perspective. The tablets do not moralize this pattern. They simply record its recurrence. There's a quiet tragedy embedded here. Humanity becomes capable of immense coordination, yet loses the ability to respond flexibly. Power grows, but wisdom contracts. The Anunnaki's withdrawal leaves a vacuum not of authority, but of humility. Without models of constrained power, institutions imagine themselves absolute. Absolute power, however, cannot adjust. It can only assert. When assertion fails, collapse follows. The memory of earlier beings lingers precisely because it offers a contrast, a glimpse of authority that once negotiated with the system rather than dominated it. But that glimpse is faint, buried beneath layers of translation and institutional reinforcement. Occasionally it resurfaces in philosophical doubt, in reform movements, in moments when rigidity breaks and adaptation briefly returns. These moments are often short-lived. Institutions reassert control. Symbols harden again. Yet the pressure does not disappear. It accumulates. The system humanity inhabits continues to operate according to its own constraints, indifferent to claims of permanence. Rivers shift, climates change, soils exhaust, populations move. Authority responds with decree rather than adjustment, with ritual rather than redistribution. The Anunnaki as symbols remain invoked, as guides they are gone. This absence shapes everything that follows. Humanity learns to manage appearance rather than function, legitimacy rather than balance. The cost of this lesson is paid repeatedly. The tablets, in their quiet way, preserve the arc without commentary. They show how authority evolves from participation to representation, from adjustment to assertion. They do not tell us this evolution is wrong. They show us what it does. And what it does is narrow the system's capacity to respond when strain returns. As the weight of accumulation grows, as cycles tighten, as imbalance resurfaces, The question becomes unavoidable. Can a system designed for negotiation survive when negotiation has been replaced by command? The Anunnaki's memory suggests it once could. Their withdrawal suggests it no longer does. Humanity continues forward, carrying structures built for permanence into a world defined by change. The tablets do not predict what follows. They simply position us at the edge of another threshold, where authority stands firm, memory thins, and pressure builds beneath the surface. And in that silence, one begins to sense that the next transition will not ask permission. It will arrive, as before, not as judgment, but as correction. Indifferent to legitimacy, unmoved by symbols, answering only to the system's limits. Whether humanity will recognize it as such remains uncertain. As pressure accumulates beneath the surface of rigid structures, something subtle begins to shift, not outwardly, but inwardly, in the way humanity senses time, responsibility, and risk. The world feels heavier now, less forgiving. Decisions carry consequences that echo more quickly, with less room for correction. The long margins once afforded by deep cycles have narrowed almost to nothing. This narrowing produces vigilance. Institutions tighten oversight. Records multiply. Boundaries are reinforced. The system appears stable, even impressive. Yet beneath this stability lies fragility born of overconfidence. What once adapted now resists. What once adjusted now endures. The tablets, in their later layers, speak increasingly of control, of fixing outcomes through lore, ritual, and force. The earth is no longer negotiated with. It is subdued. Rivers are constrained. Fields are pushed beyond tolerance. Forests recede. Each success reinforces the belief that the system can be mastered. But mastery is not the same as balance. The Anunnaki, long reduced to symbols, are invoked to sanctify this mastery. Their imagined perfection lends moral weight to expansion. If the gods are absolute, then so too must be the order that claims to represent them. Limits are treated as challenges rather than signals. This is where the danger deepens. Earlier, strain prompted adjustment. Now, strain prompts escalation. When yields fall, more land is taken. When unrest grows, authority hardens. When signs appear in the sky, interpretations multiply, each reinforcing existing power. The system responds to pressure by accelerating the very behaviors that generate it. Humanity, fully embedded within this feedback loop, begins to experience a persistent unease, an intuition that something is misaligned, even if its source remains unclear. This unease surfaces in texts as lament, in architecture as obsession with monumentality, in ritual as excess. Excess becomes compensation. The more uncertain the system's foundation feels, the more elaborate its expressions grow. Temples rise higher, laws become stricter, ceremonies more precise. Each addition promises stability, yet each increases rigidity. The Anunnaki's absence is felt most acutely here, not as loss of power, but as loss of perspective. Without models of constrained authority, institutions cannot imagine stepping back. Withdrawal appears as failure, yielding as weakness, yet the system does not negotiate with pride. Environmental limits assert themselves quietly at first. Soil salinity increases, water tables shift, seasonal patterns drift. These changes do not announce themselves as crisis. They accumulate, incremental and relentless. The tablets hint at these pressures obliquely. They speak of abandoned cities without explanation, of sudden movements of people, of rituals intensified rather than revised. Each response aims to preserve order rather than restore balance. This choice is understandable. Order is visible. Balance is subtle. The Anunnaki's earlier engagement with subtlety, adjusting flows, redistributing effort, has been replaced by blunt instruments. Control operates where coordination once did. As the margin for error shrinks, the cost of misinterpretation rises. A drought interpreted as moral failure leads to sacrifice rather than conservation. A flood seen as divine displeasure leads to appeasement rather than engineering. In this way, misunderstanding compounds strain. The system's limits do not care how they are named. They respond only to thresholds. When thresholds are crossed, correction occurs regardless of belief. The tablets do not dramatize these corrections. They record aftermath. Gaps in lineage, interruptions in building, sudden silences where activity once flourished. These silences are telling. They mark points where the system asserted itself beyond human negotiation. The Anunnaki, as symbols, remain invoked through these transitions. Their authority is cited to explain collapse after the fact. Rarely are they imagined as participants in prevention. This retrospective invocation further distances humanity from adaptive response. If collapse is explained as will, then prevention becomes irrelevant. And yet, beneath official narratives, practical knowledge persists. Farmers observe soil, builders adjust foundations, sailors read currents. These practices operate quietly, often beneath doctrine. They represent remnants of an older mode of engagement, one that responds to conditions rather than interpretations. These remnants never fully disappear. They resurface whenever ideology fails to deliver relief. But they are rarely elevated to principle. They remain craft rather than worldview. The tension between craft and doctrine defines this phase of history. Humanity knows how to adjust locally, but not systemically. It lacks permission to question the structures that demand escalation. The Anunnaki's memory could have provided such permission had it been preserved in full. Their fatigue, their debates, their acknowledgement of limits offered a model of authority compatible with adaptation. But that memory was incompatible with permanence. Thus, humanity advances with impressive confidence and diminishing flexibility. Each solution tightens constraints. Each triumph reduces options. The world grows quieter in response. Biodiversity thins. Landscapes simplify. Complexity gives way to uniformity. Uniformity feels stable until it is not. The tablet suggests that collapse does not arrive as surprise. There are warnings. Humans multiply. Laments deepen. The sense of inevitability grows. Yet inevitability is often mistaken for destiny. Destiny absolves responsibility. It frames collapse as end rather than correction. It closes inquiry. Correction, by contrast, implies learning. The system corrects regardless of whether learning occurs. The difference lies in what follows. After correction, humanity rebuilds. It always does. But what it rebuilds depends on what it believes caused the collapse. If collapse is moralized, structures harden again. If collapse is understood as systemic, adaptation becomes possible. The tablets preserve both impulses without resolving the tension. They show humanity rebuilding cities on altered ground, repeating patterns with variations. This repetition suggests that learning is partial. Some adjustments occur, others are resisted. The Anunnaki's absence continues to shape this dynamic. Without a remembered precedent for adaptive authority, institutions default to assertion. Assertion works until it doesn't. As the system tightens, the space for alternative futures narrows. Choices become constrained by previous commitments. Momentum carries decisions forward even when conditions change. This momentum is powerful. It creates the illusion of inevitability. Yet inevitability is often the result of accumulated refusal to adjust. The tablets, in their restraint, do not condemn this refusal. They simply show its consequences. They position humanity at the edge of another inflection, one shaped not by lack of intelligence or effort, but by the inability to recognize limits as guidance rather than obstacles. The Anunnaki story, when read through this lens, is not about gods or aliens or myths. It is about governance under constraint, and what happens when that governance is remembered only as command. As humanity approaches the next threshold, the question is not whether correction will occur. It will. The question is whether correction will again arrive as rupture rather than adjustment, and whether this time the fragments that survive will preserve more than symbols, whether they will carry forward enough understanding to widen the margins again. The tablets end their account without answer, leaving us with the sense that thresholds are not endpoints, but invitations, opportunities to recognize what has been forgotten before repetition hardens into fate. Whether humanity will recognize such an invitation when it arrives remains uncertain, suspended between memory and momentum, between adaptation and assertion, between what once was negotiated and what is now imposed. The pressure continues to build, and the system, indifferent to names and narratives, waits. When the story reaches this point, it no longer moves forward in events, it turns inward. The tablets fall quiet, not because nothing remains to be said, but because what remains cannot be resolved through narrative alone. The world continues, cycles persist, civilizations rise and erode, yet the deeper question lingers beneath all motion, unanchored to any single era. What does it mean to inherit a system whose origins were already obscured at the moment of inheritance? Humanity stands not at the beginning of the story, but far downstream from it. The structures we inhabit, social, ecological, symbolic, were shaped by pressures that preceded us, and were already misunderstood by the time we learned to write them down. The Anunnaki, whether remembered as beings, principles, or placeholders, mark that distance. They occupy the space between participation and abstraction, between engagement and withdrawal. Their story does not end because it was never meant to conclude. It dissolves instead into pattern. Every cycle humanity experiences carries the same tension. Expansion followed by strain, strain followed by correction, correction followed by forgetting. Each iteration strips away context while preserving form. We inherit rituals without reasons, hierarchies without memory, authority without humility. This inheritance is heavy, the rarely acknowledged as such. The tablets suggest that the greatest loss was not knowledge of events, but knowledge of limits. The Anunnaki's fatigue, their debates, their adjustments, all point toward an earlier acceptance that even authority operates within constraint. When that acceptance faded, power began to imagine itself infinite. Infinity is seductive. It promises exemption from consequence. Yet the system never grants such exemption. It responds only to accumulation and threshold. It does not punish. It does not reward. It corrects. Humanity, in forgetting this, repeatedly misreads correction as catastrophe or judgment. We search for intention where there is only response. We look for blame when there is only imbalance. The Anunnaki's withdrawal removed a mirror that once reflected these limits back to those in charge. Without that mirror, humanity learns to see only itself, its virtues, its failures, its fears, projected onto the world. This projection shapes belief, governance, and identity. It comforts and confines. It gives meaning while narrowing possibility. And yet beneath projection, the system continues to operate. Rivers shift regardless of law. Climate responds regardless of ritual. Soil remembers every extraction. The tablets never accuse humanity of error. They simply show what happens when memory narrows and responsibility expands without understanding. In this light, the Anunnaki are less an answer than a reminder. They remind us that there was once a way of relating to the world that acknowledged burden without moralizing it, that adjusted rather than judged, that recognized fatigue as signal rather than failure. Whether such a mode can be recovered is unclear. Humanity has grown powerful within the system it inherited, capable of immense coordination, rapid transformation, and global impact. Yet power amplifies consequence. The margin for error has never been smaller. The cycles that once unfolded across millennia now compress into decades. Thresholds are crossed faster than narratives can adapt. Correction accelerates. This acceleration intensifies the old question: will response arrive as adjustment or rupture? The tablets offer no guidance here. They do not predict. They do not warn explicitly. They simply end their record having traced a long arc, from participation to abstraction, from adjustment to assertion, from memory to symbol. What remains is not instruction, but orientation. They orient us toward humility, though they never name it. They gesture toward limits, though they never define them. They invite recognition that being part of a system is not the same as mastering it. In the absence of the Anunnaki, humanity occupies their former position without their former perspective. We manage, but rarely pause. We adjust locally, but struggle systemically. We remember selectively. Perhaps this is the unresolved inheritance, not labor, not authority, but the responsibility to notice when systems strain, and to respond without needing to assign blame. The story closes not with collapse nor with renewal, but with continuation. The world persists, the system breathes. Humanity remains embedded within it, asking questions framed by what it remembers and what it has forgotten. If the Anunnaki were once those who descended into complexity, then their absence leaves a challenge rather than a void. Someone must still descend. Someone must still engage with limits rather than deny them. Whether humanity can assume that role without repeating the narrowing that preceded it remains uncertain. The tablets leave us here, suspended between recognition and repetition. They do not tell us what to believe about gods or origins. They leave us with a quieter consideration, that the most important knowledge may not be about where we came from, but about how we respond when the systems that sustain us begin to strain again. The past does not ask to be restored, it asks to be understood. And understanding, unlike belief, does not harden into permanence. It remains flexible, provisional, responsive. In the end, the Anunnaki do not vanish into myth so much as dissolve into question. A question that follows humanity forward, whispering through cycles of rise and correction, asking not who controls the world, but who listens when it pushes back. The clay tablets rest in silence now, the surfaces cracked, the signs incomplete. They do not demand interpretation, they offer presence. They remind us that history did not begin with us, that responsibility arrived before comprehension, and that the system we inhabit has always required more than obedience. It has required attention. Whether that attention will arrive in time is a matter not of destiny but of choice, and so the story does not end. It waits, as systems do, balance between strain and response, leaving one final uncertainty suspended in the quiet. When the next correction comes, will it be met with fear and assertion, or with recognition, restraint, and the willingness to adjust before silence falls again?